This is a lecture for Section 1, Part 8, The Enlightenment and its Effects upon the World. In the Middle Ages, as we've talked about before, China represents one of the most technologically advanced civilizations in the world. But after the 1500s, we see that distinction begin to shift towards the West. Now, some contrast the sense of order in Chinese society with the competitive spirit that we see in Europe. Other historians tend to emphasize China's ideological viewpoint that favored living in harmony with nature rather than its domination, which was an approach of the Europeans. Yet others point to the chaos within China that drove it into isolation, an isolation that resulted from the numerous invasions that it experienced, its political corruption, European interference, and the abandonment of its educational practices. But for the most part, as far as your professor is concerned, it's probably a mixture of all of these factors. Now, the scientific revolution represented a critical period of both European and world history as it increased scientific discovery and innovation. It started around the 1500s, and we'll see it end around the 1700s. And for the most part, the reason why it is so important is because it's the beginning of modern science as we know it. It marks the creation and refinement of the scientific method that we talked about before, which is the process of discovering cause and effect relationships, which is accomplished by asking questions, carefully gathering and examining evidence, and seeing if all the available information can be combined into a logical answer. The scientific revolution grew as intellectuals popularized its ideas and used them to thoroughly examine all aspects of life, and in a lot of cases to re-examine aspects of life that once had been dominated through religious reasons. So let's look at some of the people of this period that are going to be key players in the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. First of all, one of my favorites, Galileo Galilei. His observations are going to strengthen the theories of Copernicus, who believed that the Earth and all of the planets actually revolved around the sun, which was an absolute challenge to that of the Catholic Church, who believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, a geocentric concept. Because of his challenging the church, along with the fact that maybe he was a little bit arrogant and insulting in the process, Galileo is going to be accused of being a heretic and for the most part sentenced to a life of home imprisonment in 1633. We also can go to Isaac Newton, best known for his theory about the laws of gravity. His work in Principia Mathematica and its three laws of motion greatly influenced European scientific thought throughout the centuries. Then we have Rene Descartes, often called the father of modern philosophy. He's going to lay the foundation for 17th century continental rationalism. Now, rationalism is a methodology or theory in which the criteria of truth is not sensory but intellectual and deductive. It challenged other possible sources of knowledge such as faith, tradition, and even sensory experiences. And it further reduced the role of religion in understanding life, the universe, and human thought. The widespread impact of these ideas upon the West and the 18th century are going to result in what becomes known as the Age of Enlightenment. For the most part, the Enlightenment was a movement of intellectuals who advanced the application of the scientific method to the understanding of all aspects of life. These people taught that all systems of thought were subject to the rational or scientific way of thinking. And this period, because of this, will be known as the Age of Reason. For the most part, it required people to free themselves from the perceived barriers of previous approaches in the form of numerous traditions, but mostly free themselves from the barriers created by religion. And the Enlightenment was also a philosophical movement that questioned not just the universe and its scientific approach, but the role of humans within society or within the world in general. This new philosophy would move towards a development of what could be known as the science of man. It explored possible natural laws fundamental in all areas of human life. And it's going to lead to the emergence in the 18th century of what philosophers would call the science of man. Later, it will be known as sociology or social science. In several areas such as economics, politics, and education, the philosophers are going to arrive at natural laws that they believe govern human actions. And these openly challenge the aristocratic forms of governance and encourage the rule of law for all people, no matter what their place was in society. And understand, this is an attack upon the monarchical system. This is an attack on the oligarchical system. This is the movement towards allowing groups who are normally not represented within a political system to gain some kind of representation. And to some extent, this is a very new and popular concept that is developing among not just the poor, but among Europe's elite. We know that there's no doubt that the Enlightenment impacted the political development of European states throughout the 18th century. The philosophers believed in natural rights, which were thought to be privileges that should not be withheld from any individual. These natural rights included equality before the law, freedom of religious worship, freedom of speech and press, and the right to assemble, hold property, and seek happiness. Most of these philosophers believed that people needed to be ruled by enlightened rulers who ensured that the people's natural rights were protected, and that this was, for the most part, the responsibility of a government. And that responsibility had to focus on protecting the natural rights of all of their people, not just a small select few, but for the entire population. It is during this period that we're going to see high culture meet popular culture. Now, high culture is the literary and artistic culture of the educated and wealthy. And we could also say that the academia influence that we are getting in college, that we get among scholars, would also be considered high culture. Now, popular culture, as we talked about in the previous lecture, is the written and unwritten culture of the masses. It is what is popular among the people. It is what, for the most part, kind of drives the ordinary people within a society. Now, by the 18th century, those two cultures were merging through the publications and the spread of newspapers, magazines, and other printed material. And we're going to see that this results in the explosion of radical ideas throughout Europe and throughout its population. And it again is going to further erode the power of religion within European society. And partially this is because of the growth of what they called coffee houses, which allowed for informal locations that kind of encouraged the exchange of ideas, much like you would see in a bookstore or, I guess you could say a Starbucks of our period. Here we see science and philosophy grow without the checks of the weakened church. And this growth would eventually lead to the formation of radical political ideology. And this ideology would play a major role in the formation of the upcoming American government. During this period, we're also going to see that Europe is becoming a far more robust and healthier series of states. Now, the population is going to begin to grow around 1750, and it's going to continue to increase steadily over time. We're going to see that the total European population was probably around 120 million in 1700. It will rise up to about 140 million in 1750, and by 1790 we are looking at about 190 million. And this is partially because we're seeing a falling death rate, which we, for the most part, would have to associate as being one of the major factors. And the reason why we're seeing this falling death rate is because we're seeing a significant uh, growth in food, better transportation of food supplies, which of course are going to lead to improved nutrition and the relief from devastating famines. And this leads to or is a part of the agricultural revolution of Europe. And for the most part, we're going to see this revolution cause and be the result of four interrelated factors. One, we're going to see the growth of more farmland. We're going to see an increased crop yield per acre within these farmlands. We're going to see a development of healthier and far more abundant livestock. And we're going to see an improved climate that allows a lot of this to take place. Understand, at this point, we're kind of moving out of that mini ice age that we talked about in previous lectures. Now, prior to the revolution, when we talk about farming, land was allowed to lay fallow in order to save nutrients. But because of the growth of science, the understanding of how to improve farming, we see that there's a new practice that uses alfalfa, turnips, and clover that are grown within these empty fields that actually replace the nitrogen and restore the soil's fertility. And this, of course, is going to allow for greater yields of crops. But it also has an extra benefit because those new crops are going to provide winter fodder for livestock, allowing for an ever larger number of animals. And it is because of this that we see more numerous livestock increased. And for the most part, we see a growth of the amount of meat in all European diets. So let's go back to the social classes or the social structure of this period. Now, we see that first established in the Middle Ages, the patterns of Europe's social organization continued well into the 18th century. Now, for the most part, we see that the society remained divided into the traditional orders or estates that were determined by hierarchy. And because society was still mostly rural in the 18th century, the peasantry constituted the largest social group, which we see about 85% of the European population. Now, there were rather wide differences within this group, however, because we need to understand there was a difference between free peasants and serfs. We find the serfs pretty much populated Eastern Europe and Russia, and they maintained a tie to the lands which were owned and controlled by their noble landlords. But in places like Britain, North Italy, the Low Countries, Spain, and most of France, we see that these peasants, this lower class of Europeans, were largely free and actually did have access to some form of social mobility. But despite these changes, the nobles, who constituted only about 2 to 3% of the European population, will continue to play a dominating role throughout society. Being born a noble automatically guaranteed you a place at the top of the social order. And ironically, the people who had the most money paid the less taxes. We see that landed aristocrats functioned as military officers and held most of the most important offices in the administrative machinery within the states. We see that these individuals controlled most of the life of their local districts. In other words, their social attitudes, their social norms, every aspect of pretty much what the lower class needed to follow. And we see to some extent that they are going to form a system known as the spoil system, where fortune, not experience, determined the command and political system. And understand, sometimes it's not just fortune, it's also what kind of favors you are willing to do for the people in charge. And again, the main thing to keep in mind here, it's a system not based on experience, but based on your influence through money or through actions. And during this period, though, we're going to see a transformation of towns. Initially, towns were still a distinct minority among the total population. The only real areas that we might see exceptions to this was within the Dutch Republic, Britain, and certain parts of Italy. But by the end of the 18th century, about one-sixth of the French population lived in towns of 2,000 people or more. And during the 18th century, the largest city in Europe was London, with about 1 million inhabitants. Paris was a little bit more than half that size. And we see in many of these cities, which populated Western and even Central Europe, that they had a long tradition of upper class oligarchies that continued to control their communities by dominating town and city councils. Now, an oligarchy is a form of government in which power rests within a small number of people. These people may or may not be distinguished by one or several characteristics such as nobility, fame, wealth, education, or corporate, religious, political, or even military control. Now, just below these aristocrats stood an upper crust of the middle classes, and this tended to consist of non-noble office holders, financiers, bankers, merchants, and important professionals like lawyers or doctors. Another large urban group was the lower middle class, which comprised of master artisans, shopkeepers, and small traders. And of course, below them were the laborers or the working classes and large groups of unskilled workers who served as servants, maids, and cooks at a very pitiful low wage. And understand also, we kind of talked about how the rich didn't have to pay taxes. The majority of taxes that are being levied against the people are being levied against this population of the middle class, whether it be the upper crust or the kind of lower middle class and even into the laborers. This is where the majority of the taxes are being claimed. And again, this is kind of the irony. These are the people with less money, though they are the ones who are actually keeping the countries that they live within alive and functional. So let's talk about the expansion of Britain. Though a late arrival to the Americas, by the end of the 17th century, the English had established control over most of the eastern seaboard. British North America came to consist of 13 colonies that consisted of about 1.5 million people by 1750. Now, the region was defined by two cultures. We have the northern region that maintained a diverse economy, growing population, and maintained strong ties with Europe. This would be your northern colonies, Boston, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. One of the reasons why they maintained such a diverse economy was because they did not focus on cash crops. In these areas, we see whaling, fishing, substantious farming that would be used to actually feed the population. We have the growth of small factories, shipbuilding yards. Uh, we have lumber. We have several different major businesses that are being controlled throughout this area that are actually bringing income into this northern section. And it is also here that we see fewer slaves. Now, when we go down to the southern region, we have a very small population with a singular focus upon agriculture. Now, not just all agriculture, we're talking very specifically towards cash crops. And we also see, because of this, a massive dependence upon slavery. And again, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that this dependence on slavery ended up hurting the South more than it benefited. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that if you were a poor white Southerner in the South during the age of slavery, there was hardly any work for you. You may be known among the plantation owners as white trash, but you were constantly in debt. You were constantly looking for new ways to support either yourself or your family. Because again, the primary workforce were slaves. And on top of this, because there was such a high dependence on slavery, we also see that immigration was near to nothing. There was no point in immigrating to the South because there was really no opportunity in the South. And again, this is why we see in the North that the North is where everyone from Europe would find themselves, because in the northern colonies, you had opportunity, you had possibility. And the more people that came in from Europe, the more the northern colonies had to deal with diversity. And they became more adept at dealing with diversity. And it wasn't just the diversity of the people, but as we talked about before, they also create a very diverse economy, which means should there ever be a failure within the North with one of their businesses or one of their economics foundations, they would always have something that they could fall back on. Where, of course, in the southern region, with their dependence on cash crops like tobacco, sugar, and later on cotton, if those fall apart, then they are, for the most part, hurting because there's just no replacement for them. They've completely doubled down on that concept of cash crops. However, as long as their cash crops worked, as long as they were still able to grow tobacco, they were able to grow cotton, it would be the North that then shipped them into Europe. So what we see is a very strong economic relationship between the northern colonies and the southern colonies, despite the fact that their cultures are diverging in two almost separate directions. And again, we'll see that the cultures that form throughout this region will define the people for the next 300 years. In 1534, the French are going to discover the St. Lawrence River and claim Canada as their own. Samuel de Champlain will establish a settlement in Quebec in 1608. In 1663, Canada was made the property of the French crown and administered by a French governor. Unfortunately, though, the inability of the French to persuade its people to immigrate to Canada left the territory thinly populated. In the mid-18th century, where there were only about 15,000 French Canadians, we will see that most of them were hunters, trappers, missionaries, or explorers. Not really the population that settles down and creates a firm footprint within a location. The French failed to provide adequate men or money for their American ventures, as for the most part they were focused on the wars within their own backyards. And this is, of course, going to leave them at a serious disadvantage to the British when we talk about the colonization of the Americas. But as these two countries started to populate the New World, we're going to see that conflict was inevitable. If you look at this map, we see that the blue section, of course, is French-dominated American territory, while we see that the British maintain the coastline of the Americas. But because of the fact that there's nowhere to expand eastward, the only answer for the British, of course, is to expand westward, which means that these two rival countries at some point in time were going to collide. It was inevitable. And it's going to be this collision that will trigger the beginning of discord between the colonists and their home country of England. So before we talk about the ultimate conflict between Britain and France, let's take a look at the word World War. A world war is defined as a conflict that involves multiple countries spanning multiple continents. We're going to see that throughout this course, especially as we move further and further into the 1900s. We'll have World War I, World War II, but in all honesty, we've had world wars prior to the 7 Years' War, and we'll have them in between the 7 Year War the and World War I. Now, the 7 Years' War was triggered by events in North America, but the fighting actually starts in Europe and will later move into India and again into North America. In Europe, the British and Persians are going to fight the Austrians, Russians, and the French. And it is because of this that we have at least 3 different continents that are going to be in conflict with numerous European and Asian countries. This is why we would then consider the 7 Year War a world war. Now, with its superior army and military skill, we will see that Frederick the Great of Prussia was able for some time to defeat the Austrians, the French, and the Russian armies. But ironically, this will come at very little change to the original borders. And all it really does is create chaos throughout the world. We'll definitely see, though, the major impact on the world when it comes to the 7 Year War will be the conflict between Britain and France. One of the major conflicts, one of the major focal points of their conflict will be in India, where local rulers are going to ally with the British against the French throughout their region. Now, ultimately, the British will gain full control over India, but not because they had better forces, but for the most part because they were far more persistent than the French. India will then, of course, become a British territory. And this again kind of shows some irony, as the liberator of French occupation will now become the occupier of India. And because of this, India is going to lose their sovereignty to the British, who will control all aspects of Indian life till about, I'd say, the 1930s. Now, control over India and later Egypt removes some of the British dependence upon the southern colonies of North America, especially when we talk about cotton. And this will play a major factor in the upcoming American Civil War. The major conflicts of the 7 Year War also took place, as we talked about before, in North America. And it is in North America that the 7 Year War is better known as the French and Indian War. The French maintained more troops in North America, but they had far less naval support. And this is because of the defeat of the French fleets in 1759, which prevented them from reinforcing their American garrisons or their military bases. That year, British forces are going to defeat the French outside the city of Quebec. And we'll see that the British will move on to seize Montreal, the Great Lakes area, and the Ohio Valley. And it is these 3 major victories that are going to force the French into suing for peace. And though this will be a victory for England, there were negative long-range consequences with their colonists, which we'll discuss here in a little bit. So in 1763, we will see the Treaty of Paris, which directed the French to withdraw from India and Canada, and for the most part leaving all of their territories to the British. Great Britain is going to become the world's greatest colonial power, controlling an estimated 25% of the Earth's landmass. And I kind of used this quote to you before: the empire in which the sun never sets. And that is the breadth of British control throughout the world. And it's ironic because this is a small island out off the coast of Europe. And really, it's very difficult to understand how they could become so powerful, but they do. And part of it's because they have access to all these resources throughout their conquered lands. And again, the important thing to remember here is the only reason why they were able to do this is because they have one of the most powerful navies in the world. Now, the British colonies in North America are going to profit from both the war and the victory. However, British victories cost the British government substantially. We're going to see that the national debt of Great Britain is going to rise from 75 million pounds to 133 million pounds after the war. And of course, England's going to attempt to recoup these losses, and they're going to turn to their taxpayers. And understand, we don't usually talk about this, but they're not just going after the American colonies. All British citizens are being forced to pay an increase in taxes in order to replenish the British coffers. In popular culture, we tend to think that the Enlightenment played a major role in pushing the colonies to gain independence. And though the Enlightenment will play an important role in the government's formation, we need to understand that it would be taxes, not the desire for democracy, that played the greatest role in the declining relations between the colonies and England. The colonies sought to be financially free of all of their obligations to the British businesses, the military, and the crown, even though each of those establishments provided the colonists with the spoils of the French and Indian War. We need to keep in mind that for the British, these victories constituted nothing more than another addition of red territories to a map. The people who actually benefited from the American conflict are the colonists. They are the ones who gain access to the new territories, the new lands, and get to use these lands to benefit themselves. To some extent, we can see the colonists as wanting all of the privileges of being a part of England, yet they do not want to meet any of the responsibilities of being part of England. Now, the colonists declared that no tax could be levied without the consent of their assemblies, despite the fact that they are subjects of the crown. And it's important to remember that the colonists were actually expected to pay far less in taxes than those individuals, those subjects who were actually living in England. And the colonists believed that neither the king nor parliament should interfere in their internal affairs, despite the fact that they were subjects of the crown and benefiting from the status of England throughout the world. And this kind of gets into where we move out of popular history and we get into more academic history, where we try to have a little bit more of an honest approach to what is the origin story of the United States of America. So let's approach it from this point of view. Well, we have a teenager that has graduated from high school. Its equivalent is the American colonies that are now really starting to feel like they are independent, that they can take care of themselves. However, even though the teenager and the colonies feel like they have this independence and should be able to practice this independence, they still want to live at home. They still want the benefits of living at home. They want to be able to eat at home. They want to be able to drive the family car whenever it's needed. Can find the link to the American colonies. Now, the parents, of course, and we'll say that the parents in the American situation is the king and parliament, well, they want their teenager to help at home and also maybe help with transportation costs and other costs such as groceries. They want help with the household chores, and like I said, maybe they not only do they want you to help pay for food, but they maybe might want you to cook some food once in a while. And of course, like the colonies, the teenager is going to declare that this is highly unfair. They don't want to work. They want to be able to go out and party with their friends. They want to be able to enjoy life the fullest. So as mom and dad will not give in, the teenager is going to move out of the house and into the world by themselves. And what we see when we compare that to the colonies is the colonies, again, want all of the privileges, but none of the responsibilities of being a part of England. And when England starts trying to get them to pay their taxes, to contribute to putting money back into the coffer that actually that helped fund the war, that gave these colonists far more access to new territories and land, the British colonists in the Americas start to push back. Now, to some extent, in defense of the colonists, what we see here is that for quite some time, unlike the French and the Spanish colonies, the British have allowed the colonies to work from a very independent standpoint. The colonies, for the most part, could rule themselves. They could govern themselves. As long as they met the basic requirements of the British really tried to, for the most part, keep a hands-off approach. And this is going to give the colonists a sense of freedom that maybe if it hadn't happened, we would not have seen. But unfortunately for England, the colonists are feeling independent. They are feeling like they can do this on their own, and they want special rules being applied to them. And again, the fact that they are separated by the entire Atlantic Ocean kind of gives weight to the colonies and their desire for special conditions. After a period of absolute chaos between the colonies and England, on July 4th of 1776, we'll see that the Second Continental Congress is going to approve the Declaration of Independence. Now understand that the Declaration of Independence is probably one of the most valuable and stirring political documents ever written in the history of the world. It has been copied by numerous other countries that have decided that they wanted to break from their home countries or their colonial powers. And one of the major aspects that is derived from the Enlightenment is the Declaration of Independence promise to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, more specifically, the pursuit of property. And it declared that all governments were to serve the people and their natural rights. The Declaration demanded that the colonies be free and independent states absolved of all allegiances to the British Crown, and that each colony would be a sovereign state free of a centralized government. And understand, as I said before, this document represents one of the most influential documents in the history of our planet. However, although this document is that important, it also created cognitive dissonance among not only the British and the Americans, but all those in the future who would try to use this document in order to justify their separation from their colonial powers. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a psychological state of discomfort that occurs when a person's beliefs, values, or actions conflict with each other. It can cause people to change their behaviors or beliefs in order to restore some kind of balance. And it is far more difficult and chaotic when it's applied to large groups of people. Now, an example of cognitive dissonance might be that you are a smoker who is fully aware that smoking causes cancer, or that you are known for telling lies while believing that you yourself are an honest person. But when we apply cognitive dissonance to the Americas, we find it in the Declaration of Independence with the statement that all men are created equal with inalienable human rights, and that it is the right of all people to dissolve a government that does not meet their needs. And what we're going to find is throughout American history, we're going to see challenges to these beliefs, where despite it being on paper, we don't necessarily see those actions occurring among the populace within the government. And this is why that there's a certain amount of cognitive dissonance when we talk about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence when it comes to the United States. So in the prospect of starting a new nation, the colonies, now wanting to become independent states themselves, are pushing for a new constitution which will become known as the Articles of Confederation. It created a confederation of states where each state was considered sovereign, and the federal government served nothing more as a tool, a very weak tool in times of discord between these states. The articles are going to revolve around the fear of concentrated power that the American colonists had developed when dealing with the British Empire. This concern related to their protecting their individual interests, the individual interests of the person, of the state, and of even business. And it maintained little enthusiasm for establishing a united nation with a strong centralized government, because again, they feared that a strong centralized government would only turn into a tyranny as they viewed the British Empire. Now, the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified in 1781, despite the fact that they were actually completed in 1777. And we'll find that throughout the Revolutionary War, they will become a significant hindrance. And they will lose favor among the forefathers and the elite class of the Americas. And in large part because we realize that under the Articles of Confederation, the now states are not necessarily wanting to back each other up, to support each other. We're going to find that France is going to become one of the most critical allies we could have ever had. Now remember, France has gotten itself kind of pushed around and embarrassed by the British. And though they don't want to fully engage at this point with war against the British, they're more than happy to stoke the fires of the colonies to give England that little pain in the rear that is kind of revenge for their losing Canada. France was eager to gain revenge, as I stated, for earlier defeats at the hands of the British, and they will supply the Americans money, weapons, officers, and, as I said before, later they will become fully engaged in the Revolutionary War when they supply their own soldiers and they deploy their own ships. For the most part, we will see that by the end of the Revolutionary War, the British Army is going to be forced to surrender to a combined American and French army and French fleet at the final Battle of Yorktown in 1781. We will see another Treaty of Paris signed in 1783 that recognizes the independence of the American colonies and granted the Americans control of territory from the Appalachians all the way to the Mississippi River. However, despite the fact that we could have not survived the Revolutionary War without the assistance of the French, after the Revolutionary War ends, the United States will abandon its relations with France for better relations with England. And this, of course, will create tension between the two countries and also cause political divisions within the United States itself, as we will see various different critical American forefathers, one of them being Thomas Jefferson, who supported closer relations with France, and George Washington, who tended to favor closer relationships with England. They were not the only ones of our well-known forefathers who were divided on this topic. The problem for America is now that reality is starting to set in. Let's go back to that teenager. Now, out of the house, the teenager must pay rent, pay utilities. They need to find their own transportation. And this, of course, means that they have to have a job. They have to have some type of responsibility in order to maintain this employment, which means, of course, that it's limited time with friends. And this, of course, is not what the teenager wanted. The teenager wanted to have more freedom, more opportunities to go out and party and have fun. And unfortunately, now that they're on their own, they are starting to realize that it's not that simple. For the most part, there are dire consequences if you fail to meet the demands of society. You have to make sacrifices to your personal joy in order to maintain a safe and healthy life. And everyone is, for the most part, looking towards their own survival. No one's going to come out and help you out in times of need. You need to learn to be self-sufficient. And it is these lessons that are going through the teenager that make them realize, oh crap, mom and dad were right. Now, when we equate that to the colonies, right out of the bat, they start to realize that having 13 sovereign states is going to lead to chaos, especially when you don't have a strong centralized government that can keep them in check. We will see that a lot of these states start entering into diplomatic relations with various different countries without ever considering how it would affect the Confederation. We're going to see that economic rules in one state are going to be ignored by another. To one extent, we'll actually see the fact that two states actually consider going to war with each other. There's actual violent conflicts between the two states. And this, of course, is going to cause groups of people to want to rebel against this very quickly falling apart country. And when I talked about the cognitive dissonance, we kind of get that clear when we talk about the equal rights. But when the government, when the Declaration of Independence clearly states that it is the right of all individuals to leave their country and create their own government if they're not satisfied with the government there, well, suddenly now the American government is realizing that it has to keep these rebellions quashed. That if they don't, remember, united we stand, divided we fall, the United States of America will collapse. So almost immediately we see them going against a lot of the practices that they embraced in the Declaration of Independence. For the most part, they're also realizing that taxes are critical if you want to maintain your country, if you want to maintain your economy, if you want to create a good defense system, if you want good infrastructure, you have to have taxes. So at this point, the American colonists, now free citizens of the United States of America, are realizing that maybe, just maybe, the king and parliament were maybe not so wrong after all. When our forefathers and other very critical political figures within the Americas discovered that the states could not support each other, whether it be protecting their own needs, they're failing to meet the commitments to the confederations, and that this federal government was powerless to inform or to enforce these international treaties, we're going to see that concern again grows with the fact that possibly we could see ourselves falling back into the hands of not only the English, but maybe even the French. Because remember, we kind of sort of made the French mad when we turned our back on them. And it will be George Washington who states 13 sovereignties pulling against each other, all tugging at the federal head, will soon bring ruin on the whole. So even despite the fact that we have in this country a lot of people who say that the forefathers were the masters of the 1776 Constitution, which is, of course, the Articles of Confederation, though that statement is true, they were also the same individuals who realized that it wasn't working and that there was a need, a desperate need, to change the Constitution into something that was far more functional. The problem with that is in order to make it far more functional, they needed to create a powerful centralized government. So with the United States close to collapse because of these internal conflicts and possible, as I said before, internal intervention, whether it be the French or the British or maybe even both, in the summer of 1787, 55 delegates will attend a convention in Philadelphia with the intent to revise the Articles of Confederation. The convention's delegates were wealthy, politically experienced, and very well educated. Unfortunately, there were no poor individuals. Women were not allowed to be there. There was no representation for the slaves. And for the most part, there was no representation for middle class Americans. And what we see is not that they redefine or improve on the Articles of Confederation. What we see is during this Philadelphia Convention, they actually completely get rid of the Articles of Confederation and try to create a whole new governmental constitution for the country. So this new United States Constitution is going to establish a far more stronger centralized government with a distinct level of power that, for the most part, is higher than that of the individual states. So in other words, the primary form of government within the United States would be the federal government, the central government, and the state governments will be, for the most part, lesser governments that are more focused on their specific regions, their specific states. Now, the centralized government, the federal government, is going to be divided into three branches, each with the power to check on the actions of the others. We will have legislative power that will have a vested interest in bicameral legislation that is composed of the Senate, which is elected by state legislatures during that period. Later on, we will have a change to the Constitution that says that they can be directly voted by the people themselves. And we have the House of Representatives, which to this day and even back then was elected directly by the people. Now, a president served as the chief executive with the power to execute laws, veto some legislative acts. Understand that if Congress can get 2/3 of a vote, they can supersede the President of the United States. The President could also supervise foreign affairs and direct military forces. And then we have the third, which is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was designated to enforce the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Now understand, each of these three branches are separate. They are not to be controlled by the other. They're there to check the other branches. And this was that check and balance system that was created with this new Constitution. And it would be a critical part of our country, not just back then, but even to this day. As a matter of fact, very much to this day, we see that this is how our country has maintained the integrity of our Constitution. But we need to keep in mind that the Constitution was not initially approved by all the states. The only reason why it passed was because we created a compromise with the various different states that were very uneasy about adopting this new system. And understand that the conflict between the new Constitution actually kind of fell along the lines of the North versus the South. The South saw it taking power away from them, while the North saw it as critical to their existence. So, what allowed them to finally come together and decide that this would work? Important to its success was the creation of rights that limited the government's power over the people. In March of 1789, we will see that Congress is going to enact 10 amendments to the Constitution that we now call the Bill of Rights. These were critical to a lot of those individuals who were very hesitant about going along with the new Constitution because they guaranteed the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom to petition, to assemble, as well as the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and arrests, the institution of trial by jury, and the due process of law and the protection of people's property rights. And what we're going to see is that this new government, this new Constitution, for not just the Americans, but for many people throughout the world, is going to be seen as an embodiment of the Enlightenment and its political concepts and dreams. Even with the relative speed of development, after the 1750s, we're going to see that human advancement even quickens faster. The United States, for the most part, is either a result or one of the many reasons for these changes. We kind of talked about this before, but really it's after the 1700s that we generally see that what took thousands or hundreds of years to develop is starting to happen within decades. Societies, governments, economies, and the people themselves have less time to adapt to large-scale changes. And this, for the most part, is also including changes that are on a global scale. And for the United States of America, a relatively new addition to the world, it must learn how to run before it can even walk. And it becomes a grand experiment of social, political, and legal thought. And at each stage of its development, we will see that the United States was and is forced to reevaluate its previous experiments for modification or possible termination. So during the 18th century, this experiment is going to involve forming the first democratic republic government in modern times and on a scale never before attempted. By the 19th century, we will see that the American experiment is going to seek to establish equality amongst prosperity. We'll see that by the 20th century, the experiment is going to expand to include imperialistic foreign policy and racial relations. And in its future, we will see that the creators of our Constitution would believe that its only failure could happen not from outside sources, but from within. When Benjamin Franklin left the Constitutional Convention, a woman walked up to him and asked him, "What kind of government do we have?" And he looked at her and basically stated, "We have a democratic republic, but only if you can keep it." And this kind of shows their understanding that the American experiment was delicate and that it had a greater chance of falling because of the people within the country than those outside. And it kind of gives you an appreciation of how they understood the radical nature, the untried concept that they were putting forth, not just to the Americans, but for the most part to the rest of the world. One of the other things that creates complexity within the American concept, its government, and its own society is the existence of the complex group or supergroup. Now, this represents the American populace, which consists of multiple social, racial, cultural, and political groups. These groups are made up of more groups, which are made up of more groups. And this leads to far more diversity, which is a positive thing, but also it leads to far more conflict, which is a negative thing. And we need to keep in mind that though not unique to the United States, it is not seen on such a scale that we have here in the United States. We see supergroups in England and in France and in Germany and throughout the world, but they just do not have the same scale, the amount of diversity that we experience here in the United States. And because of that, this concept of the supergroup, or the complex group, is responsible for the country's assets and also its problems. But it, for the most part, displays the complexity of American society that we don't see anywhere else. Now I would ask you, if you're having a little bit of difficulty understanding this concept, ask yourself, how many different labels could you actually apply to yourself? How many different kind of labels or groups could you actually fit into? I am a white male, so I represent a large population of America, but I was raised in Hawaii, which kind of then narrows me down to a different kind of group. I was in the United States military, which puts me in a different kind of group. I tend to be a science fiction nerd, which puts me into another group. And we could just keep going on and on and on. And it's that complexity that is a part of our country. And I would ask, when you kind of compare yourself, when you put yourself into these groups and everything else, do they conform to a national standard? Or do you find yourself sometimes being a part of that standard, but then maybe finding out that you are on the outside of that national standard? And again, that creates that complexity that we're talking about, that complex group where we have various different ways of looking at ourselves when it applies to how we are and who we are within this country. So with that in mind, imagine the difficulty there is in creating a political system that is designed to address the complex group. A system that has governments within governments. And when we say that, we're talking about city governments, state governments, and the federal government. And we're talking also about a period of time where old values were being brought into the new world. With each group, we're seeing that they bring in old baggage into the new world. And the desire to maintain the best of the old world while modifying it to the new world is going to create a second level of complexity that really is unique to the Americans. So this is how we're kind of moving forward at this point. We see the establishment of the United States of America, and keep in mind that the establishment of America is going to trigger other countries to entertain the possibility of adopting a far more enlightened government. And we're going to see that where it used to just be the European countries that dominated the world for the last, we'll say, 200 years, a new player is coming into the world, and that is the United States. And it, over a period of time, will gain more and more influence and become a major player, not just in the Western civilization, but within the world itself.